Hello and welcome to today's Honest Place episode. Today we are going to talk about why are we afraid to be beginners? So there is a real tension for me in that question. In a world where we live, we are taught to value credibility, expertise, legitimacy, and knowing how things are supposed to be done. This is very real. Being a beginner at something and not having this expertise, not having the right education, the right training, feels vulnerable, it feels exposing, it brings embarrassment, it brings feeling of not being enough. It's been a very real thing in my life. Gosh, I've had to begin something and start over so many times with each relocation, with each attempt to try and build something in the new industry. I want to share a story with you. 14 years ago, I just moved to the UK and I didn't have an extensive work experience in Russia, and I was in a new country too. So I was completely lost in terms of who I am professionally, what kind of work I can do here, who would even want to hire me as a brand new immigrant with no work experience in the country. And I did a very beginner's move at that time. I had a lot of time to myself, so I moved to the country with my partner who had work. He actually had the job offer to move the two of us to the UK. And I was alone, all by myself, at home throughout the days, thinking, how am I supposed to find my way here? And I decided to update my LinkedIn profile. I thought about, well, what kind of work I'm actually capable of doing. And what came to mind was translation work. I knew Russian, I knew English. I did a couple of freelance projects translating from English to Russian while living in Siberia. And I updated my entire LinkedIn profile as if I'm a professional translator from English to Russian and vice versa. I didn't think about that much because it literally took me an hour at most, and I forgot about it. And then, a few weeks after that, I received a message on LinkedIn from someone working at a local startup with an office and headquarters in London. And that person was running a localization department for the software company. So they needed someone to work on the Russian language and Eastern European markets. And they offered me to come in for an interview. Let's set aside how big my imposter syndrome was at that moment. But I still decided that, well, I've got a job interview, so I'm coming for that job interview. And this is what I did. I came into the headquarters. I was blown away by the fact that I'm in a real office building with real people working there during my first year in the UK. And I sat for that job interview and I just honestly shared with them that, yes, I did translation work in the past. Yes, I translated software. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to do this for your company. I actually enjoy what you guys are doing here. And I was hired on the spot. I was shocked. I thought maybe they were so desperate to fill this role that they took me, but they did. And why they took me to fill this position doesn't really matter because I landed a job, and the kind of job that I never done before. I was supposed to come into the office in the center of London and translate a real product that millions of people used every day around the world for the Russian market. And I learned to do that job after I landed that job. That was a lot of learning, and there were moments where I didn't get things right, and it worked out. It really worked out. The team was very supportive. My mistakes weren't the end of the world, and I learned so much during my time at that position, and it actually kickstarted my UK career because the colleagues from that first company have moved on to new startups, and I kept receiving job offers from my colleagues in the years that were following. And I ended up working for 3 different UK companies doing this translation and localization work for their software. Thanks to that beginner's move on taking on something that I had no idea if I would be capable of doing, I trusted myself and I went to that interview. And in the end, it worked out wonderfully because not only I had the job, I felt like I was integrating into the culture. I was picking up the professional language. I was getting the work experience. A new immigrant was suddenly a part of the professional ecosystem, and that was huge for me. And I think this is how many great new beginnings are happening, from listening to yourself and trusting yourself to take a small next step that can take you on that route. And oftentimes, we don't really need expertise to begin. We need to have courage and take one small next step that would move us to the right direction. So my second example would be the time when I started a period care company. I was already living in the US. I didn't have the job that I used to have in the UK. I thought, what do I want to do now? I faced a real problem. I didn't like my period products. I just got my period again after nursing my daughter, and it was like facing this whole period care situation from scratch. I suddenly remembered how uncomfortable all of the products I used to use were, how much plastic waste they created, and I thought to myself, what if I start a reusable period care company and make the products that I would enjoy using myself? Well, that was a very beginner's move. I had no idea what I am involving myself into. So I used my sewing machine and I created a couple of prototypes and I tried them myself. I sent them to my friends who were willing to try. I gathered feedback. I opened small Etsy store. I started researching manufacturing by watching YouTube videos. I've started researching materials by reading Facebook groups. And I'm not embarrassed to say that because that that's what allowed me to learn something totally new from scratch. I didn't have the opportunity to take another degree at that time. I didn't have time, I didn't have financial availability, and I also didn't have an opportunity to take a full-time job while being with two young children. So by doing these small beginner steps, I was able to launch a manufacturing line in the US and produce two types of reusable period products that ended up being sold in eco-friendly stores, smaller grocery stores, and had over 10,000 customers in the US, in Canada, and in Europe. And I must say, there were struggles along the way that I did not account for. Of course, I didn't, because I was beginning something totally new without having the industry knowledge. And you know what? No matter how big those struggles were, I eventually found a way to solve them. One of the big ones was finding out about a regulatory requirement in the United States for manufacturing medical devices. I had no idea that menstrual products are ranked as medical devices, but apparently they are. And if I knew how much effort and money this thing with meeting regulatory requirements would take, I don't think I would ever start that company. So not having the knowledge and learning as I was going was exactly the thing that allowed me to start this company and to move it to where it eventually went. I want to bring in one of my favorite examples of all times how being a beginner can be an advantage. And this is Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx. And Spanx was recently sold for over $1 billion. And Sarah has launched it as a solo founder with no investors. I believe her initial capital was $5,000. And what she says is, I didn't know how to start a business. I didn't know the right way to design a product. But what I didn't know ended up being my greatest asset. I tell people all the time, when you don't know how something is supposed to be done, you are way more likely to do it differently than everyone else. And that's where the magic lives. You have to believe the thing in your gut might actually be the thing that works. She recently gave a commencement speech at the Florida State University, and I want to read you my favorite lines of that speech. You will be embarrassed. And when the fear of being embarrassed loses its power over you, this is when you become the most powerful. The world does not need another version of how it's supposed to be done. The world needs you. Another example from my own life that I would love to share is when I started Women's Health Company. I wasn't coming from the medical background. I wasn't a clinician, but I was building in the health tech space. And not knowing how medical systems work from the inside, not knowing many details, has allowed me to focus on the customer's experience. What do real people go through? What are their pain points? What are their actual experiences? What seems disappointing? What do they struggle with? So instead of working from all of the regulatory requirements that we eventually needed to solve, I started working on that from the real customer's experience. And that's what allowed me to connect the product to real world struggles of real people, to build a strong community around it, and also to secure partnerships with clinicians later on, because there was an existing audience. There were people dealing with the issues that these clinicians are trained to work with. So being a beginner at that time allowed me to see people's needs clearly rather than being discouraged by the complexity of the medical system I was entering. I also feel that I need to take about this thing that I'm doing right now, the honest place, which became a series of conversation and a podcast. I've never done that before. I've never published a podcast until recently. I've never created videos for YouTube. I'm figuring out the software as I do it. I'm finding the limitations. I'm finding what works better, what doesn't work on the go. And I learn on the way too, because when I struggle with something particular, I search for the right information to move me forward. And honestly, after recording 6 episodes of The Honest Place, I already don't feel like I'm a very new person to this and I'm that much of a beginner. Because if you ask me now, I can tell you about so many details of recording and publishing a podcast, of running a YouTube channel, of creating short videos, of interacting with the audience. But it all came from starting something brand new, not having the knowledge and not having the expertise. To be totally honest with you, I still feel the pull to be an expert. It happens to me. It happens quite often where I catch myself that, well, am I really allowed to do this thing without getting the right degree first, the right training first? And I noticed that for myself, this pull is often not about the knowledge, it's about permission. Do I give myself permission to begin something before I know how to do it? Do I have trust in myself that I'll figure things out as I go? And that became the bigger area of work on myself, to be able to give myself that permission. So, to wrap up today's conversation, I want to emphasize what I feel beginnerhood gives us that expertise cannot really replace. It gives us openness. It gives us a fresh perspective. It makes us pay closer attention to whatever we are working on. It makes us scrappy. It gives us willingness to experiment and try and fail and try again. And one of the biggest things I believe it gives us is no attachment to the frameworks, how things are supposed to be done. Because those frameworks are being used by everyone around us who learned those frameworks. And what allows us to do things differently is not knowing them. If we want to learn them, if we need to learn them, and they become helpful eventually at some point, that's great. But if they restrict our creativity and the way we see the real problems in the world, leave them for someone else. And lean into your own thinking, your own view of the world, and originality. And let's wrap up this conversation with a few reflection questions that you may take time to answer for yourself. Where in your life are you currently resisting being a beginner? What do you think not knowing says about you? Where may not knowing actually be an advantage for you? And what would you start if you didn't feel the need to have credibility first? Maybe, just maybe, the goal is not to know everything in order to be able to begin something, and not to overcome being a beginner as soon as possible, but really to trust yourself, to trust your values and your passion, and believe that having this openness, having your original ideas, is actually what the world needs. And trusting that you can learn along the way. Whatever comes up, it is solvable and you are capable of solving that. I do believe that beginnerhood is not the problem. It is the beginning of something that may actually change the world for the better. And you and I can be those unique people who bring in our unique perspectives and solve something important in the world in a very unique and much needed way. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye.